is AWANI Global with me, Nailah Huda. And in this episode, we want to take a close look at developments following the recent election in Myanmar as the country marks 5 years since the launch of the military coup. Now, while the Trump administration has maintained its stance that the US State Department shall not comment on foreign elections, ASEAN meanwhile has stated that it does not it does not recognize the results of the election, which could potentially secure legitimacy for the military general Min Aung Hlaing. Now, to unpack some of the implications following this recent election and some of the responses we've seen from around the world, joining us in the studio today we have Andrea Passeri, Program Director, Bachelor of Social Science in International Relations at Taylor's University, and who's also recently launched the book Myanmar's Post-Coup Foreign Policy, Weathering Isolation and Sanctions by Routledge, that is already out for pre-order. Hi Andrea, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
Thanks for having me. I'm great, thank you.
Very happy to have you here to tell us a little bit more about, of course, your book. But before that, we, of course, want to unpack some of the recent news with the election in Myanmar. What do you think some of the results reveal, and tell us about what's going on in Myanmar right now?
Well, it's certainly an unsurprising result to many. It's an election that essentially provides a predetermined outcome that was essentially decided by the junta. Many inside Myanmar and also outside considers it as a sham election. Vast portions of the population were barred from taking part in the election, or they actually boycotted the election themselves, and also the election could not take place in vast areas of the country that are still deeply affected by the ongoing civil war. So I guess the results tell us a lot about Myanmar's authoritarian regression.
You mentioned a little bit about how most of the civilians were actually barred from taking part in the election. There's been some conflicting reports about the turnout. What do you think of that?
Well, of course, we do not have clear, reliable figures with regards to the actual turnout of the election. The junta is claiming a very high turnout because that serves the narrative of the regime itself, but it's very hard to believe that the numbers they are sharing are actually realistic considering the situation on the ground.
Right. Now, I also mentioned a little bit earlier about how this election, the results, unsurprising as you said, could potentially secure legitimacy for the next government. Do you see this happening, or could it be a lot more complicated, complex in reality?
I think we should distinguish between domestic legitimacy and international one. Domestically, the election does not add that much in terms of the credibility, the legitimacy of the government. As I said, it's no secret inside Myanmar that this was a purely cosmetic election to nurture that narrative that sees Myanmar now turning back and shifting back towards civilian rule after a period of national emergency. This is how the government labels it. Internationally, on the other hand, these, again, narrative can be useful to engage with certain actors, external actors that are, of course, not very interested in Myanmar's democratic credentials. So the junta can claim a normalization of both its domestic politics as well as international relations following this election.
So what do you think are some of the immediate implications that we can see domestically? Do you think that things will be business as usual?
Unfortunately, I do not see this election as a step towards a process of national reconciliation, which is what we are all hoping for. The pro-democracy forces will certainly see this step as a form of further entrenchment and political closure by the junta. So I am afraid that this election process won't provide any form of de-escalation to the crackdown on dissent and the ongoing civil war in Myanmar. Actually, the opposite could be true. The junta could further intensify its repression of pro-democracy forces, claiming this popular mandate that allegedly the election provided.
What does that mean then for General Min Aung Hlaing? Can we predict for him to potentially trade his military role for the presidency? How does that work?
This is actually a move that is on the card. It would again fit this whole narrative that the phase, the stage of national emergency and the direct military involvement in politics is over. He has been de facto acting as the president of Myanmar for quite some time, but a formal proclamation could again nurture that very cosmetic narrative according to which now Myanmar is ready to go back to a civilian form of government, of course under military guardianship and oversight.
What impact do you think this might have on the civil war, particularly looking at some of the ethnic armed organizations, the People's Defense Forces, of course? How have they responded or reacted to these results?
Well, they largely boycotted the elections, and they won't certainly change their stance now that the process is over. Again, when it comes to this ongoing confrontation between pro-democracy forces and the junta, the election marks yet another step in this authoritarian regression, and it shows the arbitrary, authoritarian, once again, nature of the military junta, despite these moves, this facade of legality and return to civilian rule that the election essentially symbolized.
Do you think that this could potentially be, the nail in the coffin, closing the door entirely on any return to civilian rule? What are some of the ways or the tactics for opposition forces to navigate around this?
Well, I think we should be clear in terms of what we mean by civilian rule. Once again, if by civilian rule we are thinking about the Myanmar of the mid to late 2010s, when the opposition forces were indeed allowed to, take part in the election, to contest in the election, I'm afraid that that kind of scenario will be extremely hard to, materialize again. What we will see is the semblance of a civilian political life with the military-backed party, the USDP, which won the elections in a landslide, dominating parliament, and the armed forces retaining key veto powers and key decision-making powers over the future trajectory of Myanmar, both domestically and internationally.
Now, we of course want to look at the humanitarian crisis on the sidelines of this all. What do you think is the potential political outcome? What does this mean for civilians that are already facing displacement, food insecurity, limited access to aid? There's been also recent reports of even more attacks in some regions. What does this mean humanitarian-wise?
You are absolutely right. There can definitely be a series of consequences related also to the humanitarian crisis that Myanmar has been enduring for a number of years now. Certainly, the issues that you were mentioning, access to aid, displacement, political repression are structural problems that are caused by the civil war, and these elections won't address any of these issues. So for the ordinary Myanmar people on the ground, day-to-day survival actually will matter way more than these, political arrangements that the junta is trying to orchestrate at the higher level.
Do you think that this could also increase the risk that the junta might potentially use the results of the election and potentially get whatever credibility or legitimacy that it gains from this to restrict humanitarian access even further? I mean, I've been hearing from some humanitarian groups that it has already been quite difficult to access certain areas. Does this make it even harder?
Yes, the risk is real. The junta is actually already using these elections as a sign to claim that now full sovereignty and order have been restored in Myanmar. So access to humanitarian aid could be politicized even more, and restrictions might largely and deeply impact those vulnerable populations in the remote areas of Myanmar where many minorities live. So that's certainly a risk, a clear risk that the country is facing right now.
You mentioned that it is on one of the cards up Min Aung Hlaing's sleeves that the junta rule might use this to, entrench themselves even further in government rule. How do you think international aid organizations, aid groups can navigate this, still delivering or trying to deliver access to aid for a lot of the people in Myanmar, but at the same time, working within this, it's currently in limbo, I would say. So how do you think is it for international aid groups to navigate this without, providing too much legitimacy for the government?
Yeah, it's a political tightrope that needs to be walked. I think that leaving this task completely in the hands of NGOs, namely brokering a deal with the regime in order to allow for the flow of humanitarian aid, is a daunting task. And international institutions, I'm thinking about ASEAN, but not just ASEAN, should be the mediators, the brokers that create the conditions for NGOs to then step in and provide the relief that many Myanmar citizens are desperately needing.
Yeah, you mentioned a little bit about ASEAN. Maybe you can tell us a little bit just in general stance that ASEAN has taken towards this election. Have you noticed any change in their position since sometime of end of last year?
No, I would say that ASEAN is continuing to rely on its playbook, its diplomatic toolkit. As you said at the start of this interview, there was a condemnation formally, but at the same time, ASEAN's position on Myanmar is not that firm and clear-cut. There are different sensitivities inside the association. Specifically, what ASEAN has been reiterating in the days and weeks after the election is its commitment to the five-point consensus, which is essentially the diplomatic centerpiece of its Myanmar policy. But unfortunately, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about it, as I show in the book, the five-point consensus is fraught with a series of limits that clearly hindered any possibility to achieve a real diplomatic breakthrough from 2021 all the way to 26.
Before we go into that, you mentioned a little bit about some of the different sensitivities within ASEAN itself. With Philippines as chair of ASEAN this year, do you think that this could become a sort of thorn in the flesh for ASEAN, that it could potentially drive a division amongst the countries in how to navigate this?
Well, if we want to sort of depict the positions of ASEAN countries on a continuum when it comes to the Myanmar issue, I would say that the Philippines has always tried to be somehow equidistant between those actors inside ASEAN who have been quite vocal, and Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia are amongst those, and the countries that kept a much lower profile, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand. So it would be interesting to see how the Filipino chairmanship tries to navigate in between these different nuances that the association is clearly displaying right now.
Could this then drive ASEAN to rethink its approach from the five-point consensus? I mean, you mentioned a little bit about some of the challenges that they've had with this approach. What are they? What's the obstacles here?
Well, in my humble opinion, one of the clearest limits of the 5-point consensus as it was drafted back in 2021 is the role of the special envoy to Myanmar, who has to be essentially reappointed every year following the rotation of the ASEAN chairmanship itself. Actually, in 2025, Malaysia did quite a remarkable job when it comes to Myanmar, brokering a series of, especially one truce, one temporary truce in the conflict in the wake of the earthquake that struck Myanmar late last year. But unfortunately, all this progress, this engagement that was built with the junta has been now essentially erased by the fact that the special envoy role had to be handed over to the new chairman, so we are back at square one. And this is what has been happening for 5 years now. So probably a reform of the 5-point consensus that contemplates a longer mandate for the ASEAN envoy will allow for a more incisive action on the part of the association.
I mean, this incisive action, this reform, do you think this could realistically happen in the near future?
Well, considering, the way ASEAN works, its reliance on a consensus-driven decision-making, the so-called ASEAN way, that would mean bringing on board all the members of the association, which is a pretty difficult task to achieve in such a short span of time.
Beyond ASEAN, I think it would be interesting to also look at some of the stance or the positions taken by other countries, major powers specifically. Before we go into Russia and China, we want to also look at the US. We've heard from some reports, the Trump administration instructing the State Department not to comment on foreign elections, and evidently they've been rather silent on the recent election in Myanmar. What do you think, if we were to see the West remaining silent on this, what kind of impact could this have on Myanmar in the long term?
Yeah, I mean, the sad reality is that it seems that the West has completely forgotten about Myanmar. If we look at the European Union, for instance, it has been quite vocally, at least on a rhetorical level in the past, in denouncing the abuses and the brutality of the Myanmar regime, but right now the EU seems completely absorbed by the conflict in Ukraine on one hand, and also its pretty tumultuous relationship, transatlantic relationship with the United States. On the other hand, the Trump administration, as you said, essentially neglected the Myanmar issue, didn't pay any significant efforts in looking into this diplomatic crisis. That's in part a consequence of the America First ideology that shapes the Trump administration. But, at the same time, in recent weeks, we have listened President Trump voicing support for the civilians being repressed in Iran. On the other hand, he never actually expressed a similar sentiment towards the Myanmar crisis and the Myanmar population that is being so hardly repressed.
Maybe it could potentially just be that Trump sees he's not going to get a win as easy and quick as he did with Thailand and Cambodia, which I think he enjoyed the attention that it had to do with that. With this Western disengagement, the lack of attention from the US, do you think that this pushes Myanmar even further into the orbit of other major powers, China and Russia?
It is not an automatic consequence, but indeed we have witnessed, actually since 2017, since the brutal Rohingya crisis of 2017, a clear divorce, a clear fracture between Myanmar and the West, and this fracture has deepened even further in the last few years. As a result, Myanmar today relies on a much narrower set of diplomatic partners. Russia and China are at the top of this list. But what is interesting, and that is also one of the elements I try to unpack in my book is that Myanmar is not completely isolated. It still maintains a certain degree of agency in dealing with these great powers and is using Russia and China as mutual counterweights. I think we received a pretty interesting news yesterday that Myanmar and Russia are finalizing or strengthening their military partnership, which has been a factor for quite some time now. Russia is by far the largest supplier of military hardware to the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar's armed forces. So this is yet another sign that the junta is still trying to preserve its non-aligned posture, albeit the range of diplomatic partners that it can engage is rather limited. And let's not also forget that tacitly, the junta has also tried to preserve and nurture its ties with India and Japan, which condemned the coup but never joined the sanction regime.
Right. We, of course, want to talk a little bit about your book. Tell us what has been sort of in the back of your mind throughout this whole process of writing.
I would say that the main reason that pushed me to write this book is essentially to dispel two cliches, two myths that are quite present, especially in the West, when it comes to looking at what's going on in Myanmar. As I was mentioning just now, the first myth is that the junta is a completely irrational and brutal actor. I'm not, of course, denying the brutality and the violence of what the junta has been doing, but there is a rationality, there is a logic in what it's doing, especially when it comes to the diplomatic and international alignments. And the second cliche that I wanted to correct with this book is that, again, Myanmar is isolated. Very often in the West, we equate the word with us. So if a country doesn't, maintain cordial and productive ties with the West, with the EU, with the United States, that means that country is marginalized or isolated in the international stage. The scenario, the picture is not so clear-cut and black and white. So the junta, despite the divorce from the West that we were recalling just now, is not an isolated regime, and that's what I try to show in the book.
Perhaps that's from the Western perspective, but do you think that ASEAN member states, some of these neighboring countries, do you think they have a deep understanding of the sort of situation, the sort of position that Myanmar is in globally?
Well, of course, I think here in Southeast Asia, there is the awareness that the analysis should be far more nuanced. In the West, we Westerners look at Myanmar from afar, and the risk of oversimplifying the scenario and the analysis is real. And that's why I wanted, with this book, to speak both to a Southeast Asian audience, but also to a Western audience, in order to provide some elements that allow us to depict the Myanmar crisis in its real contours, rather than, again, relying on very simplistic, schematic, black or white representations of it.
Do you talk a little bit in your book about some of the risks that we can expect for Myanmar if it were to go on to this trajectory in the next potentially few years?
Well, the risks, especially for Southeast Asia, are multiple. We are talking about a country that is essentially becoming a failed state in the heart of the region. And that triggers a series of security challenges, from asymmetric security challenges to more traditional ones for neighboring countries, but I would argue for the region as a whole. So this is actually a litmus test for ASEAN to show that its role can be conducive to at least a de-escalation of the civil war. We are not expecting for any miracles happening overnight, but a de-escalation of the civil conflict would definitely be a welcome step in the right direction.
Yeah, one of many things we can expect in your new book, Myanmar's Post-Coup Foreign Policy, Weathering Isolation and Sanctions, already out for pre-order. Thank you so much, Andrea, for joining us today, telling us a little bit about what we can expect, some of the immediate fallout implications from the recent election in Myanmar, some of the responses that we've seen from around the world, not as isolated as we'd like to believe. Of course, thank you once again for that. That is all on AWANI Global this week. We'll catch you next time on AWANI Global.